Economic effects of the Civil War. Before the American Civil War, the South primarily depended on unpaid slave labor to cultivate and harvest cash crops. The majority of paper money was composed of banknotes produced by private banks, and infrastructure, such as roadways, canals, and railroads, was scarce west of the Mississippi River. All of that underwent a significant transformation as a consequence of the American Civil War. The government subsidized the settlement of the West. Wartime expenditure significantly increased industry and infrastructure, and government-issued currency became increasingly popular. The critical mass of government power and spending that was established by Civil War spending ultimately led to the development of the Western territories and the transformation of the United States into a significant world power. The United States had experienced a significant economic divide between the North and South by 1850. Although the United States had originated as a predominantly agricultural nation in the early 1780s, the North had established a significant industrial sector in urban areas by the mid-1800s. In contrast, the South had maintained an almost exclusively agrarian lifestyle. The South had little political desire to industrialize, as it relied on slavery to provide unpaid labor for the growing and harvesting of cash commodities such as cotton and tobacco. The North's industrialization was facilitated by the consistent immigration of Europeans. In the 1840s, the North's rapid industrialization was facilitated by the massive importation of German and Irish laborers to the United States, which was influenced by a devastating potato famine in Europe. Low-cost immigrant labor was a significant factor in this development. This immigration not only increased the North's population at a more accelerated pace, but it also provided a larger labor force than the South. This resulted in a deteriorating political power balance, as northern states began to dominate the Electoral College and the U.S. House of Representatives, where representatives were allocated based on population. Industrial North versus agrarian South. An increasing economic and cultural divide was the result of the persistence of slavery in the South. A quarter of Northerners resided in cities by 1860. At this juncture, the majority of employees in the region were engaged in industry or commerce, as opposed to agriculture. The overwhelming majority of immigrants to the United States, almost all of whom were from Europe, remained in the North due to improved job opportunities, increased transportation access, and the availability of finished goods. The North experienced a significantly greater rate of industrial expansion as a result of the combination of all of these factors. The South had minimal incentive to allocate resources to industrial development due to the warm climate and fertile soil, as well as unpaid labor through enslavement. The transportation of heavy finished products was more challenging in the South than in the North due to the absence of railroads and canals. In contrast to numerous cities in the North, only a small number of southern cities had sufficient populations to sustain manufacturing. The political and socio-cultural divide between the North and South was exacerbated by the expanding economic divide, which resulted in the leaders of the two regions being unable to reach a consensus. American Civil War economic causes. Slavery. British colonization resulted in the introduction of slavery to the southern region. It had become essential for agricultural labor by the 1850s. The plantation system necessitated a significant amount of physical labor for the mass production of tobacco and cotton, which would result in a financial calamity for affluent farmers if slave labor were replaced with wage labor. By 1860, the American South was producing 3/4 of the world's cotton, and wealthy planters were highly successful in their use of slavery. The political support for slavery in the South was unwavering, as the copious profits enjoyed by plantation owners would be destroyed if slavery were to be abolished. Nevertheless, the Second Great Awakening religious movement in the 1830s marked the beginning of a trend of escalating opposition to the ironclad support for slavery. Many Americans, particularly those in the North, came to oppose slavery for religious reasons. The Second Great Awakening served as an impetus for the expanding abolition movement, which aimed to eradicate slavery on a national scale. In response, proponents of slavery intensified their arguments, asserting that slavery was essential for the economic survival and the well-being of slaves. Supporters of slavery frequently employed racist arguments to argue that blacks were not cognitively capable of managing their affairs, and therefore required masters to guarantee their welfare. Tariffs and trade. Economic causes of the American Civil War. A second issue emerged as a result of the South's lack of economic diversification. Tariffs, which are taxes on imports. During the early 1800s, the United States imported a significant number of finished products from Europe. However, the North gradually increased the production of its finished products. Subsequently, the central government was motivated to safeguard the emerging northern industries by allocating imports to European competitors. This caused concern in the South, which was more dependent on European imports than the North. The tariffs have resulted in a significant increase in the cost of European products, which has disproportionately affected the prices of finished goods for Southern consumers. Up until the commencement of the Civil War, Southern opposition to tariffs was a political matter. To augment the central government's revenue, the Republican Party advocated for tariff increases in the late 1850s. Southerners were incensed when Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln emerged victorious in the 1860 presidential election, despite not being on the ballot in 10 Southern states. They were unable to sustain slavery and low tariffs in the long term due to their diminished political influence. The North's wartime economy. War ensued in April, following the South's separation from the United States in early 1861 and the establishment of an independent nation, the Confederate States of America. North Korea capitalized on substantial wartime expenditures as a result of its substantial industrial base. The United States government can allocate billions of dollars to its military, which encompasses the cost of uniforms, pay, and supplies for its personnel. This resulted in substantial profits for northern factories, particularly those that manufactured rifles and other military equipment. Nevertheless, the North's population was more than twice as large as the South's, even though the North spent twice as much during the conflict. This resulted in a lower per capita wartime expenditure in the North, which in turn alleviated the burden on taxpayers. Although the South rapidly lost territory and was compelled to dedicate a significant number of white farmers to military service during the Civil War, the North maintained its own agricultural and industrial foundation. The North's economy experienced substantial growth during the conflict, which was facilitated by government spending. The Confederacy's government spending was reduced during the conflict, and it was unable to mobilize promptly to oversee wartime production. The South's preference for state sovereignty, which was akin to the nation under the ill-fated Articles of Confederation, was catastrophic for the war effort. Economic consequences of the American Civil War in the long term. The process of settling the Western region. A substantial military and industrial infrastructure was established in the North following the conclusion of the United States Civil War. The Republican administrations in Washington, D.C. were able to utilize this infrastructure to settle the West and fulfill the manifest destiny objective of America's original creators. The Southern states' military occupation following the conflict resulted in a substantial U.S. Army that could be employed for purposes other than defense, as had been the case before the civil conflict. The central government could readily employ the ample military manpower available after 1865 to pacify the Native Americans in the West. The railroads, which were constructed with government assistance, also contributed to the settlement of the West by expediting the depletion of the bison, which was invaluable to Native Americans. Railroads were employed by buffalo hunters to access vast populations of bison, which they slaughtered by the thousands with high-powered rifles. In the face of the loss of their bison herds and the presence of a potent U.S. Army, numerous Native American tribes were compelled to relocate to reservations. Long-term economic consequences. The establishment of the United States dollar. Industrialization, modern taxation, finance, and the use of paper currency are all often attributed to the U.S. Civil War as the catalyst for the development of the modern economy. Before the Civil War, there was minimal utilization of deficit expenditure and no income tax, and consumers preferred gold dollars to paper currency. The high costs of the conflict resulted in a rapid transformation of this situation. The North and South both sold bonds to finance the war as a result of deficit spending government expenditures exceeding tax revenue, imposed an income tax for the first time, and utilized paper currency. The Union initially printed demand notes, which are also referred to as greenbacks, in 1861. The government commenced the printing of United States notes the following year and proclaimed them to be legal tender. The term green became synonymous with currency as a result of the green ink that gave rise to the nickname greenbacks. Paper currency continued to be prevalent following the Civil War, despite the widespread dissatisfaction with the replacement of gold coinage. The paper dollar was entirely backed by the United States government, and gold coinage was no longer minted as legal tender currency in 1933. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more exclusive content and updates.